Yes, welcome to Bible Academics. My name is Richard Musimbuzi. Yes, are you someone who is beginning to doubt the essence of Christmas, and maybe you're wondering, maybe Christmas is just a Santa Claus idea? Then perhaps The Case for Christmas by Lee Strobel is a book you need to think of reading in this. Yes, who is Lee Strobel? Yeah, Lee Strobel is an American Christian author and a former investigative journalist. He has written several books which focus on the truthfulness of Christianity, and he has received many awards for writing some of these books. Now, what inspires Lee Strobel? Lee Strobel is inspired by a small family of a 60-year-old lady living with two daughters. And they are living in an environment that is so humble. They literally have nothing. They're just staying in a room, but they have nothing, maybe a table in the kitchen. So Strobel, while he was interacting with this family, he saw their compassion. He looked at their love for God, even amidst their crisis. And of course, he goes ahead, begins to fundraise some food items and other compassion items. But later on, Lee continues to have that question in his mind. What makes these people, this family, love God even amidst their crisis? And he's also touched by a scenario that happened, when he had offered them these compassion items through the mobilization he had done. He finds that the family was actually sharing their items with other people in the neighborhood, and that challenged him to actually go out and find out more about this Jesus. Does this Jesus really exist? Is his identity true, even as people continue to follow through thinking about Christmas and trying to understand the born King? So this is what inspired Lee Strobel to go ahead and even do some more research about the identity of Christ. In this book written by Lee Strobel, the information that we are going to be talking about is gathered by the different interviews that were done by Lee, and he focuses on four scholars who gave him some information that he uses to write this book. We are going to see Craig L. Bloomberg, who has written about the famous book about the historicity of Jesus Christ, and also John McRae, who is an archaeological professor who has written, John McRae, who is a professor of the New Testament and archaeology at the Wheaton College, and he has been there for 15 years. Then he also interviewed Donald A. Carson, who is a professor of the New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and his focus was on Jesus fulfilling the attributes of God. And then the other person that will be interviewed is Louis S. Lapides, who is the one, is from a Jewish family and a scholar, of course, a Bible scholar, and has focused on the fingerprint evidence of Jesus Christ, whether Jesus is actually the Messiah. So these are the four people that Lee Strobel is focusing on as we go through this book. Yes, so the first interview that was done with Craig Bloomberg. So when Lee was interviewing, these are some of the ideas that came through. So he's actually saying the eyewitness evidence. Can the biography of Jesus be trusted? So actually in his writings, actually, as he was interacting with Bloomberg, the Gospels actually they relate well in information. The information that Mark gives, the information that Matthew gives, the information that Luke gives, they are related as we focus on the story of Jesus Christ. And then the other thing, of course, looking at the book of John, of course, focusing on the deity of Jesus Christ. Actually, though he did not write what Mark, Luke, and Matthew were saying, but he actually added on the deity of Christ. He focused on Jesus being the I am. And actually, when you look at his writings, they also relate with the writings of Matthew and Luke, because they also focus on some writings about Jesus, acknowledging that he is the I am, he is the Son of God. So there is a relation there. So of course, also in the writings, they're also showing us that Mark, of course, he was the one from whom the writings of Matthew came. Matthew borrowed from Mark, and also Luke borrowed from Mark. But then also there are some writings that they also talk about the Q document, the mystery book, the Q document. And in this document, there were listings of sayings about Jesus, the different lists of sayings about Jesus Christ, but which actually not narratives. So we can also see that there is some evidence that indeed Jesus' biography, or the biographies of the writers of Jesus, are actually true, because the information that they are giving is related. The story of the birth of Jesus in Luke is similar to the story of the birth of Jesus in Matthew. And also John is related a bit when it comes to the identity of Jesus Christ. Now the other thing we look at is the apocryphal books. Now the apocryphal books are writings that were written later, but are actually acknowledging that the writers of the Gospels were actually the authors. One of them is Papias and also Irenaeus. Papias of 125 AD and also Irenaeus of 180 AD. They all acknowledge that these books were written by the authors. Considering the virgin birth, a philosopher called William Craig actually is saying it doesn't make sense to say that Jesus was born without a genetic material. But he later on concludes and says, one needs to believe and to trust that a time will come when there will be clear evidence about the virgin birth. So it's an issue of faith. And also Bloomberg is actually acknowledging that despite some of these questions in our minds, there will always be an evidence, and we just need to believe this experience. So later on, Bloomberg concludes that if God was the creator of the universe, then a woman giving birth to a child without anything like a material in the womb to produce the child was very possible. So he says we have a reason to believe if God was able to create the world, then he was able to ensure that Mary gives birth to a child even without meeting a man. Maybe you're doubting the authorship of the different writers of the Gospels. Lee goes ahead to interview John McCrae so that we can maybe be convinced that surely Jesus was born, and the essence of Christmas. Now, he looks at something else called the scientific evidence. Does archaeology actually confirm that the biographies of Jesus are true? Now, different writers have said different things about Luke. Majority of them agree that Luke is actually the author of the Gospel of Luke. But there are some scholars who still doubt, and they give their reasons. One of them, when you look at Luke chapter 3 and verse 1, it actually talks about Lysanias being the tetrarch of Abilene. Now, when the different scholars were checking out, they were not finding that evidence that Lysanias was the tetrarch of Abilene. But the good news is that of recent, the archaeologists found an inscription that was dating from the time of Tiberius in 14 AD to 37 AD. And that inscription shows that Lysanias was the tetrarch of Abilene actually. He was the tetrarch of Abilene. And it actually confirmed that actually what Luke was talking about was actually true, because some of them were saying that Luke didn't know what he was talking about. But that's already one evidence that Luke surely was the writer of the Gospel of Luke. And then the other thing that they looked at was Luke chapter 17 and verse 6. And in that text, there is a statement called the polytax, or translated in the NIV, it is actually the city officials. Now, this word was not found in many of the writings, even in the Apocrypha. But also recently, an inscription was also found by the archaeologists, which actually was talking about the polytax. And actually, to date, there are over 35 inscriptions that have been found with the statements, the polytax. And when you go to the British Museum, there is that evidence of that inscription of the polytax. So there is no reason to doubt that Luke was the writer of the Gospel of Luke. In John chapter 5 and verse 1 to 15, actually, there is another doubt by the different scholars concerning the authorship of these Gospels. Now, one of them is that John was actually talking about Jesus healing an invalid by the pool of Bethesda. And it's actually said that there were 5 porticos, or pathways, or walkways. And this was not found in many of the writings in history. But the good news is that recently the archaeologists did an excavation that was 40 feet below, and it was discovered that there were actually the 5 porticos, or the walkways that were talked about in John chapter 5, which actually proves that John knows what he was talking about, and he surely knew that these 5 porticos were there. In the writings of Luke, again, also there is something that is going to puzzle us, but the writer is going to help us understand. One of them is the census. Luke talks about a census that was done, and the scholars keep saying, but there has been no record of a census. They don't see it in history, even in the writings. No one is talking about this census. There's no clear evidence about the census. But a recent discovery was made, and in this discovery, an ancient census was done, and actually it is said by Macrae, he quotes, saying that the official government order dated 104 AD, in which Gaius Fabius was the prefect of Egypt. This is what he says: seeing that the time has come for the house-to-house census, it is necessary to compel all those who, for any case whatsoever, are residing out of their provinces to return to their homes. This was a practice. So the census was a practice, and this is evidence that really that census happened. So this writing was discovered, and it was seen that, and it even happened much later, that is AD 104. But this shows that this was a practice, and so we cannot doubt that Luke did not know what he was talking about. He actually knew, and he had evidence of this census. He had seen it, he had received it from the different witnesses. Yes, the other thing it is said, Luke actually is saying that this census was done during the time when Quirinius was governing Syria during the reign of Herod the Great. And actually, archaeologists have discovered this evidence actually in an inscription that was written on Quirinius. Now an eminent archaeologist known as Jerry made a discovery about this, and he actually says that a coin with the name Quirinius on it was found with micrographic letters. This places him as a proconsul of Syria and Cilicia from 11 BC until after the death of Herod. Yes, so this shows that there was actually like 2 Quiriniuses, maybe in the reign of Quirinius I, maybe Quirinius II. So it is very possible that there was a Quirinius who lived at the time when Luke when this event was happening, the census. And it's very possible that later on there was another Quirinius. So we cannot rule out that indeed this census happened during the time of Quirinius, who was governor of Syria. Yes, the other puzzling thing is, did Nazareth exist? Now, an atheist called Frank Zindler actually said that Nazareth did not exist. And his reasons was he did not see it mentioned in the Old Testament, and there was no evidence. Even other writings in the New Testament, apart from the Gospels, they don't talk about Nazareth. So he's actually saying Nazareth was a myth, it did not exist. But later on, through the writings of Dr. James Strange, he actually says that this city existed. It was actually about 60 acres, and it was accommodating a population of about 480 people. And the other thing is that later on also it was discovered that there was a list of Aramaic writings which actually described a group of 24 families that had to relocate after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. At that time, the priests were no longer needed, so they had to relocate, and it's actually mentioned in those listings in Aramaic that 24 families had to relocate. And in those families, there was a family that had to relocate to a place called Nazareth. So it is very, very true that Nazareth really existed, because this writing actually showed that this family was relocating in Nazareth. The other puzzling thing is about the slaughter of babies in Bethlehem. Actually, the scholars are actually saying that this wasn't true, because it's not very clear. There is no evidence, there is no writing about some of these things. That's what they were saying. But the fact is, when you read about Herod, Herod was known for killing. He killed so many people, and killing was part of him. It was not a strange thing. And then, of course, we have to acknowledge that Bethlehem was a small town, and the probability of there being so many 2-year-born babies was really very low. And so even if there were babies that were killed in Bethlehem, it was not a number that would really scare or a number that would really attract the audience of many, because there were very few babies that could have actually been killed. So it's not something that we can say that is not true, because even the numbers in Bethlehem were not very many. Yeah, and maybe because there were no journalists then, and maybe there were no radio stations or TV stations, but we cannot say that the babies were not killed, because there were few babies in that town, and those few babies could not capture the audience of the world to record it in history. The other evidence that Lee wants us to look at is about the profile evidence. And in this evidence, Lee actually interviews Donald A. Carson, and this is what he has to say. He actually says that in the Old Testament there were different attributes that were attached to God. They were talking about God and giving him these attributes, being the omnipresent God, being the omnipotent God, and all these attributes we see them being confirmed with Jesus Christ. In another interview, Lee is actually interviewing Donald A. Carson. He's looking at the profile evidence. Did Jesus fulfill the attributes of God? In the Old Testament, there are so many attributes of God, as an omnipotent God, omnipresent God. Yeah, all these attributes are there. So Jesus is seen fulfilling some of these attributes, like in Matthew 28 and verse 20. Is an omnipresence God. He says, I will be with you to the end of ages, when he's telling the disciples. And then also is an omnipotent God. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That is Matthew 28 and verse 18. So we are seeing the attributes of God. Now when you also see in Colossians chapter When you see in Colossians chapter 1 verse 15, it actually acknowledges that Jesus Christ is the firstborn. Yeah, that Jesus Christ is the firstborn of all creation. Colossians chapter 1:15. And then also in John 3:16, Jesus is actually acknowledging that he's the begotten Son. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He's acknowledging that he was begotten and not made. So these are the attributes of God which show evidence that Jesus indeed fulfilled the attributes of God. And so he's real. And when we are celebrating Christmas, we are talking about a real God. He's not just a myth. And then also in Philippians chapter 2, we see Jesus actually emptying himself of all the attributes of God and comes down on us to identify with man. He humbled himself and he put on the nature of man. So we are seeing Jesus acknowledging that he has the attributes of God, which is written in Philippians chapter 2 by Paul, is actually saying Jesus acknowledged that he had the attributes of God, but he emptied himself of all these attributes and came to identify with man. Yes, and finally, we want to look at the fingerprint evidence of Jesus Christ. Did Jesus match the Messiah that was prophesied? Now, the interview was done with a gentleman called Louis S. Lapides, and this Louis was of a Jewish background, and he actually acknowledged that he did not believe in the New Testament, and of course, because he was also anti-Semitic, and he did not believe in Jesus Christ. But he believed in the Old Testament. So later on, as he kept on interacting with the different religions from the East, interacting with the different religions of Buddha, he came to a conclusion that, it's not about being subjective, but being objective. And he was searching for the truth. And later on, in his search for the truth as a Jew, he later on is convicted by the statements of the pastor to go and find out whether Jesus was not the Messiah. And he reads the Old Testament, but now, of course, trying to find out whether Jesus was prophesied and was fulfilled in the New Testament. And this is what he has to say. He discovered about the manner of the Messiah's birth in Isaiah. It shows the manner of his birth. And then in Micah, it actually shows where this Messiah would be born, in Bethlehem. And then also he discovered in the book of Psalms about the betrayal of this Messiah. And then also in Genesis and Jeremiah, he discovered the ancestry lineage of this Messiah. Of course, him being was going to be the descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So these discoveries were made by Louis as he kept on reading the scriptures. Of course, being a Jew, he is later on convicted that he needs to read the Old Testament in search for this Messiah and to see how he's fulfilled in the New Testament. So the turning point for Lapides was when he actually opened the New Testament, and when he read, he was convicted now to go back to the Old Testament to discover how this Messiah was being fulfilled in the New Testament. It was after all these findings that Lapides concluded that he needed to be objective rather than subjective. Yes, so in conclusion, what can we say? Is all this thing of Christmas true, or it's just a myth? But this is how the writer concludes it. He's actually saying that there is an empty tomb. Jesus is no longer in the tomb. He resurrected. And this is a confirmation that he is really existing. There are so many religions that attribute, there are so many religions that follow their God. But many of these gods they look up to, some of them, their dead bodies are still in the tomb, but Jesus is no longer in the tomb. And then the other thing he concludes with is the writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul actually is confirming that the disciples were there to witness this Jesus. They walked with him, and he confirms it, and he confirms his death and his resurrection. And so that's one of the things that really can encourage us that surely as we celebrate Christmas, this Jesus we are talking about is actually real. And then of course we cannot leave out the sacrifice made by the disciples. Many disciples were slaughtered alive. Many of them were persecuted. Many of them were killed. And nobody can sacrifice for something that is not real. And this is one of the things that encourages the writer, actually saying that no one could have actually dared to die unless he was sure that what he was dying for was actually true. And of course, we cannot rule out that Jesus was a gift. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. If you're someone who's out there and you're doubting about Christmas, then you need to read this book by Lee Strobel, The Case for Christmas. Therefore, I wish you a Merry Christmas and a prosperous New Year. Thank you for loving Bible Academics, and I believe that the Lord will continue to bless you in this season.